Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Michael Davis from Mira Scriptura, and today we're going to start to get into the nitty-gritty. A lot of it's going to be experimental. I'm just trying to figure out my own methodology. Usually I tend to do most of my studies in my head, and that doesn't really help me or others, so I'm trying to formulate what exactly my process is. So I'm going to start off here by looking at a website. This is BibleArc.com. It's not really necessary for mirror reading, but I like to use it for one little thing, and I'll tell you that in a little bit here. But let me first just tell you what BibleArc.com is all about. Basically, it helps you break things into phrases and then identifies those phrases and marks them with a particular type of logical relationship. So here are the relationships over here. There's a whole bunch of them. Negative, positive, question, answer, if-then statements. And it's really, it's pretty good. I was reluctant to like it at first. It seemed a little mundane, but it's helpful to understand the logical flow of a biblical writer, especially someone like Paul, who just kind of runs on and has quite a bit of depth to what he's saying. So it's pretty helpful. And now I use the bracketing. There's also another method they have called arcing, which is very similar. It just uses arcs, but I think the bracketing is more structured, and visually I think it's just easier to look at. But having said all that, you really don't need to pay attention to anything on the left-hand side here, because it's all about the logical flow and logical relationships, which is not really what we're going to use for mirror reading. But if you're into that type of thing, be sure to check out BibleArc.com. They're not paying me to promote their website or anything. I just happen to come across it. So the thing that I like to use BibleArc for is the breaking up into propositional phrases. And what I mean by that, and it's propositional, not prepositional. It's propositional phrases. And propositional phrases are essentially any phrase that has a verb. So there are exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, that's what a propositional phrase is. A phrase with a verb. And I like that because I needed some kind of unit to mirror read, because I was saying, well, should I mirror read a verse or a sentence or a word? Like, I needed some kind of chunk as a basis to start with, and I wasn't sure how big of a chunk I needed to do. And using BibleArc, I think propositional phrases are a good chunk to start with. So, and what this does is, if you just click in the verse here, it'll break it into another line, and so it's easier to break into phrases, and it keeps the verse numbers here, but adds the A, B, C, D, and then you can undo it. Okay, so when I mirror read, I try to start off as breaking the verses up into propositional phrases, and then I categorize them into 4 different categories. So they're different, unique, opposite, and same. So what I mean by that is, in this case, is Paul saying something different or similar to what the false teachers were saying? Is he taking the same words as the false teachers and just giving it a little spin? Or so that would be different. And then, or opposite, is he just saying the exact opposite of what the false teachers are saying? And then the same, is Paul saying the same that the false teachers were saying? And a lot of times that has to do with things like quotes. So the Paul and the false teachers are both quoting the same thing, so they would be using the same verbiage. And then the last one, unique, that would be words that are unique to Paul or whoever the writer is, and that the false teachers were not necessarily using. Now, just because they're unique, Paul is still addressing the false teachings He's just doing it with his own unique words, as opposed to having them be different, adding his own unique spin to it, or having it be opposite, or having it being the same, like a quote. So, for example, here, the first verse here, I marked it as different, and it says, "O foolish Galatians," and the opposite would be, "O wise Galatians." But this is different in that I think that false teachers were saying that Paul was foolish, his teachings were foolish, and so Paul kind of spins that around on them and calls the Galatians foolish. Now the phrase down here I marked as unique. It says, "It was before your eyes." So I don't think that this was any kind of wordage or verbiage that the false teachers were using. So I don't think that this phrase is similar or opposite of what the false teachers were saying. I think it was unique to Paul, although he's using it to address false teachings that the false teachers were saying. So it's unique to Paul. But I will say that I suspect that the phrase is a play on words, because later in Galatians, Paul talks about his own eyes, and there seems to be an issue with his eyes. Like his eyesight is not that great. And so Paul is playing on that issue and saying it was before the Galatians' eyes. So it is a word play. He is using terminology, how we talked about in an earlier episode about importing terminology. The words are unique to Paul. Okay, and so the next phrase here, that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. I think this is opposite. I think that false teachers were saying that Jesus Christ was not publicly portrayed as crucified. And then the final one down here, I marked as same. It says, "Are you so foolish?" I think this was a question that was posed to Paul, asking, and maybe not verbatim, and maybe even the question was implied, was Paul foolish? And so he's spinning that same question around to them. Now, you might be asking, well, how do you know if a phrase is different or unique or opposite or the same? How do you know that? What's your proof? What's your evidence? Or how do you determine that? And that's a great question, and it's one that I hope to answer in the next episode. I cannot talk.